really, really strong job numbers, a really nice bounce back from the month of May. Do you think we're overestimating some of the weakness that some people think will come through 2019 and into 2020?
Well, I don't know why. You know, there's always this chorus of people that want to be pessimistic. I would simply say that the big numbers today, 224,000, good wage increases still above 3%, low unemployment rate. We are still in a very strong prosperity cycle. It's a growth cycle. It's a prosperity cycle. Here, July 4th, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Things are looking pretty good. I can't explain the chronic pessimism. All I'll say is we have very good pro-growth policies, low taxes, deregulation, opening energy, trade reform. I think the incentives of our supply-side policies are working, and I don't know why people don't want to see that. I'm very optimistic, as you might guess.
Larry, you haven't been afraid to wade in to the debate around the Federal Reserve. A lot of people asking the question, what does July 5th, the data today, mean for July 31st, the Federal Reserve meeting? What is the case for a rate cut after this labour market report, Larry?
Well, look, I don't think, here we go again. I don't think there's a Phillips curve trade-off between strong jobs, for example, and higher inflation and interest rates. I don't believe that. I think more people working and succeeding is fabulous. And I think the evidence shows that the inflation rate is rock bottom. I was just looking at some of the market figures on the way over here again. Not only do you have an inverted yield curve, which I think is somewhat troublesome for the longer term, but the break-evens on the inflation, the tips break-evens, the 5-year, Jonathan, is 1.5%, and that's a CPI number. So the PCE deflator that the Fed uses would be about 30 basis points less than that. So you're 1.25% inflation, which is way below the Fed's target and what most people want. And that's the reason I think they should take back the interest rate hike. Now, I'm not encroaching on Fed independence. I'm actually just reading the market tea leaves, if you ask me. The Fed will act in its own time. But I'm just saying I think that's the case. And then I guess, secondly, with a weak global economy, taking out an insurance policy is not a bad thing.
So, Larry, I think the debate a lot of people are having is how lower rates will actually help, whether the price of credit is the problem in, say, the United States, whether the price of credit is the problem in Europe. And most people are answering no to that question. How will a lower rate actually help address some of the issues you outlined, Larry?
Well, look, I just don't want anything to interfere with this strong prosperity cycle. That's my principal point. And I think, as market signals have been suggesting for quite some time, the interest rate story it looks unbalanced. I mean, anytime, it's not that I'm going to inject stimulus here. I'm not really looking at that old model. I'm just saying that when 10-year Treasury paper is trading well below the Fed funds rate or the 3-month Treasury bill rate, I think that's a message to the Fed that their target rate is too high, frankly. And I think they're looking at that. I'm not sure that our views are much different than the Fed's views. I don't know when they'll act. They're an independent agency. But that's my basic point. This is not so much about stimulus as putting more balance into the financial sector and the yield curve.
Larry, let's talk about trade, shall we? There's some talk, some reports that we might get face-to-face meetings sometime soon, perhaps even next week. Can you talk to me about that? Could they begin next week, the face-to-face talks between the United States and China?
Well, I can't confirm the face-to-face next week. I know there are discussions ongoing that will get the two teams together at some point in the near future. What I want to say is they're on the phone. The leaders, the senior people on both sides, Liu He from China, Ambassador Lighthizer, Secretary Mnuchin for the USA. They'll be on the phone. They've been on the phone. They'll be on the phone this coming week. I think a face-to-face meeting is in the cards. I don't want to get ahead of that story. But I think it's a positive story. As you know, last week or 2 weekends ago, the president basically reopened the talks. I think it's always better to talk than not to talk.
Let's talk about the content of those talks. Do we restart from fresh? Secretary Mnuchin said we were 90% of the way there. We were 90% of the way there. And I'm wondering if that's the starting position or whether we start again, Larry. Which one is it?
Well, I know that the U.S. team much favors where we left off last May. Now, again, I don't want to get engaged in a lot of hypotheticals here, but I think what Steve Mnuchin is saying, and I think Bob Lighthizer agrees, I know I certainly do, we made a lot of headway. Then the talks stopped in May, as you know, and now they're going to resume. So why not start from where we left off? We didn't have a deal, but we made progress on a lot of fronts. Now, I want to reiterate something, because there's always things in the newspapers and on the media and whatnot. Let's not forget the basics here with respect to ending intellectual property theft, forced transfer of technology, various cyber hacking and cyber interference issues, tariff and non-tariff barriers, unbalanced trade conditions in general, and of course, perhaps the most important one is the enforcement mechanisms. Now, having said that, Jonathan, the U.S. side believes we did make headway, and that's exactly where we should pick up the story. The president indicated as much at the G20 talks in Osaka. So that's our view, basically. Let's try to cross the finish line, but it's still going to be difficult, no question.
Well, let's talk about some of those difficulties. The president has allowed Huawei to start buying technology from U.S. firms once again, suspended another round of tariffs perhaps as well. What did the president get in return this last weekend, Larry?
Well, look, the talks have been reopened, and there is the expectation that China, almost in good faith, but I hope as a matter of continuing policy, will continue or will pick up the purchases of various U.S. imported goods and services, most particularly the agriculture and farming sector. We think that's actually part of the goodwill agreement, in return for which, as you noted, the president said we will suspend tariff increases from this point on. But look, it's not so much tit for tat. You didn't get any new deals coming out of Osaka. What you got was a continuation of the talks, which is a good thing. And let's see if we can make any forward progress on where we left off last May. There are never any preconditions. The United States has never suggested any preconditions for this. But I think the relaxation of the tariff threat is a positive goodwill gesture.
Larry, you've said in the past that the Huawei issue is separate from the trade negotiations. It looks like it's part of the broader trade negotiations now. Can you confirm that?
Well, actually, I've never said that they were separate. Maybe somebody else did. That's not my view. The president's view, which is what matters, is that they will be part of the general talks regarding trade. And I think that's quite evident from what happened in Osaka. And again, if there's any confusion, Jonathan, let me try to clear up. With respect to, shall we say, a little more lenient treatment of Huawei, we're not talking about family jewels. We're not talking about 5G. We're not talking about core issues with respect to telecom and so forth. We're talking about what I've called general merchandise. The Commerce Department may decide to grant some additional licensing for telecom products that are the low tech and are readily available around the world, Jonathan. I want to make this as clear as I possibly can. Stuff that could be bought in Asia, for example, that will probably be relaxed. But Huawei remains on the entity list. We remain very concerned that Huawei's relationship with the Chinese government may be a difficult problem, sensitive issues for national security. We will not open licenses for any national security areas, be they chips or whatever. We're just looking at stuff that's readily available on world markets and does not have any national security inferences.
But Larry, this gets a little bit complex because from a foreign diplomacy point of view, how could the United States have any diplomatic influence on foreign governments and their interaction with the likes of Huawei when the United States puts Huawei as part of a broader bilateral trade negotiation? That gets a little bit complex, doesn't it?
Well, I'm not sure, Jonathan, where you're going on that one. I mean, remember, we are in very close touch with our allies, the Five Eyes, Germany, France, regarding the Huawei problem. I mean, the national security related issues are enormous in the U.S., in Asia, and in Europe. And all these governments, and we're in touch with them, you know, Secretary Pompeo, John Bolton, and many others, including myself, we're in touch with these nations to talk about the Huawei threat to our security. So this is part of the overall diplomacy. I don't think it's a break in diplomacy. And we're all working towards the same end, which is a safe and secure alliance to make sure that Chinese inroads into our security are prevented, frankly.
Final question for you, Larry, just on the timeline. Are you comfortable with these negotiations running into 2020, an election year, or do you need to get this addressed in the back half of this year?
Well, look, there's no timeline. We've said this again and again. I've said it on your show and others. I'm trying to clarify. The president wants a quality deal. He said this in Osaka, and he's many times before Osaka. We want to resolve the sticky issues. We want to resolve the security issues. We want to resolve the trade issues. This is, of course, crucial to the economy of the U.S., to manufacturing, to farming, to technology, you name it. So there's no timeline. The issue is we want quality. We don't have to have speed. And frankly, I don't think that's linked to the elections in 2020. I think that's a matter of U.S. economic, trade, and national security policy. We will only sign on to a deal that is in the interest of the United States. As President Trump has often said, it has to be a great deal.